Good morning and welcome to this week's recruitment discussion with the Jump team. And this week we're going to finalise the series that we've been over the last 4 weeks, which has been all about basically planning for next year, about your people, are they fit for next year, etc. And today we're going to cover something that I think is sort of highly contentious in lots of recruitment agencies. Is we're going to look at incentives and what works and what motivates, and do your incentives actually create the desired effect that they're actually designed to do. And as always, we start these sessions off with some facts. So I've been busy away this morning, beaver away, looking at the internet and finding out facts on incentives and what's going on. There's some quite interesting things. So when you ask what to be or what needs to be recognized, 50% of sales reps prefer reward experiences than focus solely on being presented an award. Companies utilizing an incentive program report a 79% success rate in achieving their established goals when the correct rewards were offered. And a properly structured incentive program can increase employee performance by 44%. On average, between 40 and 50% of employees preferred a total award experience, having nothing to do with the physical reward itself, but rather the award presentation and the professional development of that. 58% of people say they would feel more engaged if the leader gave recognition to the job they were doing. And this is a strange one that I picked up, but it's an interesting sort of call to look at. 99% of people have a unique set of reward preferences. So making a point program is a great I bet if you want people to be interested, make it scalable, and there's something for everybody. But if you have to choose one reward, they say the best reward to choose is travel. However, salespeople have been known to walk away from roles up to £30,000 in potential commission just to make a trip. So it's interesting that how powerful a travel reward is. Sales professionals have some characteristics in common, but treating them as a group without accounting for what motivates them individually isn't the way to successfully implement a sales incentive program. And Harvard Business Review suggested companies recognize the differences between adjusted their sales incentives to address the people. So it was like viewing the sales team like a sort of portfolio of investments that required different levels of kind of attention and different levels of performance right across the team. And a couple of years ago, the Fast Forward company did some research with Warwick University and found that happy workers are 12% more productive than unhappy workers who were 10% less productive. And that said, the researchers sort of came back and basically said that managers need to explain the mission statement and emphasize to the team how the mission statement contributes to the overall business. But what they failed to do was actually tell them how the individual employee was actually involved in trying to accomplish the business targets and rewards and what part they had to play in. Where they found that those people understood their part, they found that that was the biggest incentive to most employees, just feeling that they were part of something that would make a huge difference to the overall company operation. So lots of facts there about incentives, both financially and non-financially based. Today I'm joined by Dave. Heather's on client side, and PJ is, I believe, he's having a CT scan at this moment in time. So let's hope it all goes well for PJ as he's down there. So Dave, let's kick off. Okay, so here's a question. It sounds a stupid question when we first ask it, but when we start to think about it, it's probably a little bit more in depth. What's the true reason for implementing an incentive program?
Morning, H. Morning, everyone. I think the answer to the question is almost in the title that's on the screen there. The whole idea about the true reason for incentives is to motivate our staff to perform, to get accelerated performance. Yes, it's a reward, but obviously what we want is our businesses to perform as best they can, our individuals to perform as best they can. And sometimes everyone can perform a little bit better. And the incentive is there to capture that little bit better performance. And I think it's also important to say at the very beginning for this webinar, that incentives, I think, are important for the whole business, not just the sales or front office part of the business, because I've seen incentives work really, really well when you include others, when you include the whole company in the business. Whereas most of the stats, and absolutely right, most boards that I see, whiteboards or racing boards or IT boards or whatever you see in companies, most of them have the salespeople, but not the rest that keep the business going. So it's there to motivate. That's the reason why you have incentives.
It's interesting, isn't it, that it's the same comment. It is to motivate the whole of the staff. And it was interesting that I've worked with lots of companies that do this, where you can see the intrinsic rewards for their sales staff, and their back office, then it's almost a vote for somebody who goes on, and the back office then feels that they are not part of that, and they feel that maybe they'd be better rewarded if they felt that they were contributing, or it was their input to what was going on was being rewarded and their work was being rewarded. So it's really interesting to sort of that last fact when we talked about that being part of the mission and understanding where they fit into the mission and how they have helped to drive the company towards its end goals. For some people, and for most employees, was reward enough and incentive enough to actually work for that company. So it was more about that, how you're rewarded and what people feel on that. So it's an interesting sort of view, but that it is about rewarding all, but it's how we reward all. So let's look at it in a different way then. Why is it important then to create a blended incentive program of both monetary and non-monetary incentives?
And I think, Howard, if you go back to some of the stats that you said earlier on, simply because not everybody is incentivized by money. A lot of sales folk earn quite well, or they have a basic salary with a commission, and if it's a good commission scheme and they're performing well, then they will earn well on commission, and deservedly so. For some of the support services, they may get a smaller bonus, but clearly that isn't as linked to company success. So therefore, an incentive that isn't monetary for them could be quite a good thing, but for others it could be, actually, I wouldn't mind a bit more money because I don't earn as much as some other people in the business. So I think it is very important to have that blend. It could be everybody gets to go on a trip. It could be that we get to do stuff as a team. But for me, it's important to have a blend that encapsulates everybody in the business. And as people think about, well, what incentives work for the culture that you have in your business, the best thing to do is to ask the people what it is that would motivate them. Because you and I must have worked with people, who, when they know they've qualified for a trip, the last thing they want to do is go on a trip with their colleagues.
It was fun. It was fun.
I've been very fortunate enough to go on a number of trips, and I've enjoyed them all. But that isn't to say that everybody who went on them really enjoyed them, because they would have rather done something else.
See, I think it's interesting because I was never money wasn't my big driver. Hitting targets and being successful was my driver, and that was my incentive, and money was just a byproduct of that. But sometimes what did incentivize me was some of the non-monetary things that people were giving out. And what I found was some of the biggest things that I gave out as stupid little incentives had the biggest impact. I remember I had a lad work for me he'd been working for us for about 8 months, 9 months, and was starting to really hit the sales. And what we'd noticed was that he'd come in the same suit every single day, and it was getting a bit shinier and shinier and shinier. So I set him a target and said, right, here's the target. Okay, if you hit this target, what we're going to do, we're going to go to Team Lewin, we're going to buy you a business winning suit, and we're going to go buy you a pair of shoes, a business winning shoes. And I've never seen anyone work so hard. It was just a very personal incentive. It cost us about 500 quid, but we got far more than 500 quid back from him. He was just absolutely brilliant. But it's driving that. And I think you're right. Some people are very driven by a money incentive. And let's take commission out, because although that is an incentive, it's the norm. These are over and above the norms that we're talking about. These are incentives we put in as an occasional thing. And I think sometimes it's the non-money ones that have a better way of driving the business, bringing the business closer together, making people to work in a team as a collective. And I think they're the ones that sometimes sort of drive and motivate people more because they can see and feel it. It's something that maybe, but yeah, I sometimes think we've talked about going on trips. I think sometimes going on places that you would never normally go as a trip is something really, big to get onto.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's non-monetary. You're going to, you might have to spend some money when you're there, etc. You might not, depending on the company, but it's going somewhere as a group as a reward for the overall performance. And I think some things like that are really important for people to drive to get people there. Here's a question then. Why do some incentives then crash and burn and almost become almost divisive and maybe very demotivational for some type of people?
I think because you can't please everybody all the time, particularly if you haven't involved them. So if the company comes up with an incentive and you've got 20 people in your company and 10 buy into it, 10 aren't affected by it because they're not involved, you may get 5 who they look at it and go, no, that's not for me. I don't want to go to Iceland, or I don't want to go on a gun shooting thing, or I don't want to go to the lakes, or whatever it may be, whatever the incentive may be. If they're not bought into it, it then becomes one of those things that if it's visually represented and constantly people are being reminded about where the company is, which is how incentives should be, and you haven't bought into it because you don't think it's going to be any good, it could be either you're a bit of a mood hoover and you don't like that sort of thing and going on in the business, or it could be that you're just not bought into it. And then to your point, Howard, it does become a bit of a disincentive, because the more the company talks about it, the more excited it gets, the more the people who are getting closer to qualify, the more those that aren't, that didn't really buy into it in the first place, get a bit frustrated by it.
And I think sometimes it's how you set the incentive. And I'm not so bothered about where it's going and what the incentive is. And if I look at, say, I remember having this conversation annually at Adecco about how they set their annual incentive for the big winners trip. But I knew full well that if the incentive was set in January, by the end of January, probably 60-70% of the business were completely switched off against the incentive. Right. The reason why, because the way it had been set, it was so obvious that the big billers and the people who had got long tenure will bring in the people who would win the trip, and no one else will be able to get on it. And so it just disincentivized people. And then obviously, as you said, the more they promoted it, the more they talked about it, the more they sent out the league charts, etc. It just didn't involve everybody within the company. And it sort of felt that it was just highlighting those and putting those at the top onto a pedestal that other people couldn't get anywhere near. And it felt very, very, very demotivational for quite a lot of the staff that would never get there. And even when they brought out, well, let's bring out an extra bit for newcomers and things like that, again, it was only a very small percentage of those people were going. So again, people dropped out of it. And I remember sort of sat there in September and I did a straw poll of my division. And I think round about 75 to 80% of the people just didn't care about the incentive. Going into the last quarter where you're thinking that's a bit where the incentive should be driving the business, they weren't interested. So I think the reason why it crashes and burns is if people don't feel that they are going to be able to achieve it, then they drop out really quickly and it becomes a de-incentive. So it's not about where it's going or what it's doing. It's, do people feel that they can achieve the incentive? Obviously, the flip side of that is if you haven't done a straw poll on your business and find out what they actually want, then what you've actually put up as an incentive might not float anybody's boat whatsoever. So again, finding what people actually want, I think, is really important when we start to talk about driving an incentive into a business that actually motivates the business and motivates everyone in the business to achieve.
Yeah.
So the flip side of that, why does something crash and burn, is talked about there about having a individual versus a team incentive. And obviously there's a time and place for both, but why should you implement both on an individual and on a team basis?
Well, I think it's important to reward individuals for different jobs that they do. By reward, I mean incentivize for different jobs. For example, when you're running a recruitment business, getting requirements in and closing those is really important. But equally important is getting the cash in. A lot of sales folk go out and get the jobs, they close them, but then the company doesn't pay for 60 days or 90 days. And that tends not to be, in most recruitment companies, a salesperson's problem. It's someone in the finance team. Well, if there's any FDs on this call, I'd be glad to hear me. I'm always asking companies I work with, what's your DSO? What's your debtor days outstanding? Because if you could get that down to, say, 32, 33, 34, whatever that may be, that's really great. If it's on 40, 42, 44, that's a significant amount of cash that you're not generating, and it does have an impact on the profit of your business. So therefore, why not incentivize the individuals who are part of that team to collect cash earlier? You're getting your DSO down by 1 day is a real achievement. Now, you could argue, well, that's their job anyway, that's what they're paid to do. But actually having an incentive to do that is really good. So I think having incentives for individuals matters, but then they're part of a team. So it could be important that the support services team have something that they're working towards, or each part of the support services team could have something that they're working towards, and then they have an incentive. And many companies, as we've experienced, have an end of year incentive for the whole firm. A lot of them have it just for sales, but a lot of them have it for the whole firm. A number of the companies that I work with, they have a whole firm incentive. And if we do this, this is where we're all going to go. And we're not talking about flying off to Las Vegas or somewhere like that. We're talking about maybe a long night out, a weekend away, something like that. And some of it is definitely to the point that you made at the very beginning. Some of it is about having an experience together with your colleagues, for those that like that sort of thing, that is really motivational.
I think the team incentives is about that. It's about that experience of togetherness and growing the unity, and therefore it has to be front and back to make sure both sides of the business actually get there. And then individual incentives, I think, should be placed in about driving certain aspects within the business. So I've just rolled one out about 3 months ago with a client for back office for that very thing, Dave, to get sales in. Right. And I think what we're trying to do is trying to educate not so much the back office, because they were tracing really hard, but educate the front office. And it was interesting when we spoke to the front office about what the issues that back office have. So we then incentivized the front office, which were slightly divorced from the back office, slightly divorced from the front office, to actually work hand in glove. And what we discovered was so many processes that were broken and not working that the front office didn't want to do, and therefore didn't do it, but it actually slowed down their sales. And what we did, we put an incentive in for the front office and an incentive in for the back office, which were slightly different. And what it did, it cured all those little bottlenecks that were there, and they were coming back and saying, this needs to be cured, this needs to be cured, this needs to be cured. So both sides there. And what we ended up with is a lot smoother business process that's now driven their day sales outstanding down by 10 days, purely because the back office weren't spending the first 10 days of that trying to actually get the invoice out, because they couldn't get it out because the front office weren't doing the right things. And so I think if you start to connect your individual incentives to processes, then what we start to do is drive behavior. And I think those individual incentives should be all about driving behavior in the business, but right across the business. And that way it will start to streamline and make your business quicker, faster, and more improvement. And again, we go back to that first point, is if people feel that they are part of the journey and accomplishing things for the journey, then sometimes it's just the recognition itself that really drives them to do that. And I think that's what you find in back office. They're not particularly bothered so much about money. Yes, they like it, but it's the reward of feeling that they've done a really good job, because really they're the people that don't get that reward constantly, where the salespeople get that constant recognition of you're doing a good job, you're doing a good job, where back office is just expected to do the certain things. And that's what we changed from a management point of view, was how we praised and how we verbally, written and emotionally incentivize the people. Plus the reward on top of that, the incentive on top of that, change the culture of the way the front and the back office work together. So I think if we start to think about some of the things that we do when we put incentives in place, we've got to start to think about the cultural input that it has, as well as the business input that it can create for the business.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. Money versus material incentives. So how do these help create a stronger culture within the business?
I think it isn't one or the other. It isn't that money's right and other things are wrong. I think it's just, what is the culture of the company that you have created or are trying to create? Is it a very salesy focused company? Is it about winning new business and securing customers? Do you have something in there that involves your customer? For example, a customer survey, whereby if you poll your customers and they come back with an 80%, for example, and then the whole business gets a reward, because you want happy customers, because happy customers will buy more from you, and if they buy more from you, you will make more money. It doesn't matter whether that's recruitment or any other business. So I think you've got to ask yourself, if you're the leader of a business and you're on this call and you're leading a business, what is the type of culture that you are creating or that you want to create? Is it a very sales focused, sales driven, customer focused business? Is it a more reactive business whereby you have a number of big clients and you just respond to them? Are you using your data or data from Jump or the REC or any other organization to inform your customers about what's going on in the market, and therefore you're having engaged conversations with your customers? If it's that type of culture, then the sales prizes or the incentives that you've got can reflect that as well. Because I bet you those sort of people would be more interested in experiences than, should we say, just hard cash. Whereas some of the support services may just be more interested in cash. So there's no right or wrong. I think it just depends on what is the type of culture you want. And when you look at things like the Sunday Times Best Companies to Work For, and there's so many of these type of rewards and awards that you can get, money is often not one of the top three things that drive incentives or that drive accelerated performance. Now, obviously, those companies aren't just recruitment companies. But when you look at the Sunday Times Top 100, there's at least 10% of those are recruitment companies. I think that's partly because we can fill out these things very well, but it's partly because we've got engaged staff. So they tend to do very well in those rewards type best company to work for type companies, that we do very well in that. And therefore you look at what incentivizes those people who will work in the top 100, and money tends to be 4 or 5.
It was interesting. We were both, and he's on the actual call today, listening to the candidate speak in the at the Rec Expo down in Birmingham.
Great talk.
And the one thing he brought out was, a dream incentive that says, whatever it is that you want, if you achieve a certain thing, then we will either put money towards it or help you do those sort of things. So it becomes a very personal incentive, and that could be material. It could be, it wasn't based around money, it's based around what the person wants, and it starts to create that sort of personal bond between the company and the employee. And when you start to think about material incentives, it's, what are you trying to create within the culture? What are you trying to get? And I think sometimes, simple things like, we laughed at duvet days and time off, etc. But now with flexible working, people are now sort of thinking that they were really good at the time, but now they're sort of changing because those things aren't happening. I had a conversation with a client the other day about Christmas. What do you do during Christmas? Well, we have 20 days holiday, and they've got to book Christmas off through those holidays. And so it's a real bind for the consultants, but, a material giveaway of giving them those 3 days for free, would be a huge incentive to the staff to drive that. And, we put another company, we put an incentive in and say, over Q4, if we do this as a business, and it wasn't about hitting sales figures, it was more about making the business more clinical as a working process. then those 3 days would become automatically free for you. And that's what they did. And they drove to it because they saw the material advantage for them rather than just the monetary gain that you can sometimes get. And I think sometimes that we seem to forget that those things that, drive money in, because money sometimes can be a great driver, but can sometimes be very decisive with some people, and split the business in certain ways, because it's what money does. It splits people. So I think sometimes when it's more material based, it becomes a little bit more palatable to all, and everyone is rewarded by it, and everyone feels the recognition from it. And I think it's that togetherness, whether it be an individual or whether it be a collective incentive, that sort of helps to drive people.
I think you hit very well on the hybrid working, because it's different for all of us now, managing and running businesses where not all of our staff are all together all the time. And in my experience in 30 odd years of recruitment, the best rewards, the best incentives have been holiday based. Now, maybe that's because I quite like holidays, and so that suits me. But as a salesperson, I really liked it, and I wanted to qualify for the travel. I think where we've been cooped up for 18 months or so because of what went on over the last few years, and the fact that now so many of us are working from home or based from home, the idea of having an incentive where collectively we get together and go somewhere is even more powerful than perhaps it was before 2020. Because we don't see each other as often as we used to. And that may not be true for all of the companies on here. You may all be back to work 5 days a week in the office, but most of the companies that I work with have some sort of hybrid model. So they're not all together as often as they'd like to be. So therefore an incentive to say, you know what we're going to do? Hit your target this month and we're all going to go bowling. Hit your target this quarter and we're all going to take a day out. Hit your target this year and we're all going to go on holiday. Something like that. That seems to be driving accelerated performance in a number of the companies that I know of.
But this sort of leads to that sort of view, doesn't it? That, we're driving incentives based on performance and based on what we're doing. We could also be driving incentives in that might not seem an incentive. A team building exercise might not seem like an incentive, but taking people away would be an incentive for them. Getting things that people feel that they are helping the business grow might not be an incentive, because you don't have to put a target to achieve those sort of things. But then other people might feel that that's a great part of the business, what they're doing. And I think it's all about certain benefits. And Annette's put in there, certain incentives are subject to tax.
Yes, she's right, of course.
This is one thing that sort of did and didn't annoy me. Well, it did annoy me, because when we were going on certain trips with certain companies, we were going to do certain charitable work for half a day, which no one really got involved with. But what that did was write the tax off, because it was a charitable event. And it was really wrong. I thought that if you're going to do it, let's do that properly. But I've got certain companies that I work with that do lots of stuff for, to become carbon neutral. They're doing lots of things. And so the incentive for the business is to become carbon neutral, and that then puts back into their business, but also puts back into their population, back into their local community, etc. And so there's all sort of different incentives that we can start to think about that don't have to be money, don't have to be travel, but are more rewarding for the overall business, and gain that collective spirit, which is what we're trying to drive with most incentives, I think, is to drive performance and make the business perform in a better way. So sometimes it's not just about hitting a target. Sometimes I think it's about giving the right incentive to people to help them become collectively better at their job. So if you start thinking about, if you get promoted, the incentive to get promoted might be that you then can go on this training course or that training course. It's not just about the money that you might increase your salary about, it's how else you can increase your own personal development. To me, that was a real big incentive. The big incentive to me to go from one place to another place was the training and development that I was going to get when I went somewhere, because it was far greater, and that would help me improve my career, which then ultimately would help me improve the business if I was better at what I was doing. So it was things like that. So here's a question then. In your opinion, Dave, what's the best incentive that you've implemented, and what impact did it have?
Well, this is an easy one to answer, but it comes from the fact that I was fortunate enough to be the MD of a big corporate company, i.e. Spring. So we had 1,115 staff, we had lots of offices. So we were able to afford a slightly bigger incentive. But our annual incentive, we had holidays and we had all sorts of things, but we came up with the idea of giving away a Mini. So the Mini had been recently launched, and we got one of these really, really nice Mini Cooper S's, one of the first ones. And how people qualified for it, they were each given individual targets about what they did. So it was for everybody in the business, including receptionists, including the MD was included. So I was included in it as well. And if you hit a number of targets, you got a raffle ticket. So you could secure over a period of time a number of raffle tickets. Each of the raffle tickets went into a raffle that the company awards do, and we had the Mini hanging up in the middle of the ballroom. I'm glad it didn't fall on anybody, but it was hanging up in the middle of the ballroom, and everybody, or most people, had a number of raffle tickets. Some had 10, some had 1 or 2, and then there were 10 prizes, and the first prize was the Mini. And it was just a great night, and it was fantastic because I can still remember the name of the lady who won it. Her name was Jackie Bunce. She was one of the resources in our Horsham office, and it was her ticket that won the Mini. And she only had 1 ticket, and she won it, and it was brilliant, and it wasn't rigged in any way. It was just a great thing. To Annette's point, yes, it did cost us quite a lot of money from a tax and HMRC point, but it was simply the best incentive. But because everybody, literally everybody in the company was involved in it in some way, and they all felt, actually, I'm part of it. Whatever became of the Mini, I don't know, but it was a big incentive. You can't do that when you're running a company of 20 people. I accept that, and most of the people that Jump work with, most of our clients have between 5 and 25, 30 consultants, but that was the best incentive that we'd ever put together.
It's interesting because that sort of goes right across the whole business and how people qualify, and goes back to that conversation about qualification. Because I think one of the best incentives that I've seen run was a Q4 incentive where we created something similar to what you're talking about. We created a tombola situation, but we'd gone out and bought, I think, about 25 different prizes. And then what we did was we had, for every time someone made a sale, or we changed it weekly. So from the front office, it might be sales, it might be KPI driven. From the back office, it was performance and certain things we were trying to do. But every time they achieved that, people got a list of raffle tickets. And the more raffle tickets they get, then the more things that went into the thing. And then when we started to draw them out. And it was really interesting then when we went to the actual Christmas do, all of these prizes were there. People were drawing the raffles out, etc., etc. And it was stupid things, from things that might cost a couple of quid to things that were, a couple of £1,000. But it really brought the company together because everyone had the opportunity to win. And I think that's what you're getting at there, Dave, is everyone had the opportunity to win and be part of that. And Karen Deep's asked an interesting question. What do you think of group holidays and group incentives for everyone, when they eat personal time out the weekends, etc.? So I think the answer is yes and no to that. I mean, I was with a client yesterday, and one of the back office people who had been chosen to go on the incentive has said, I'm too busy to go. I've got things at home that I want to do. I don't want to really go. I don't feel part of it, etc. And therefore has chosen not to go. And so, yes, you're right. For some people, it's not. But for a lot of people, it actually is. So it depends how it's done. And I think it depends how far in advance that you get to know whether you are going or not, rather than this was quite a quick one and was told last week that she was going. And it was like, okay, well, I've got other things planned. I've got things to do that I can't, you are eating into my time, so to speak. Yeah. So maybe not so much an incentive. So I think it's when that incentive is rolled out. I also think the timing of the incentives then is really important, that have people got time to plan their personal life potentially around that incentive if they're going. So it's a double-edged sword, really, Karen. Yes and no is the answer. Yes, some people love it and some people won't, but it depends how you roll that out and what you do with it to get the collective together. from there. But that's just the same as going for a meal on an evening, isn't it? And sort of taking your team out for a meal on an evening. Some people might not want to go because they don't want to go to eat it. I'm not a particularly great lover of Chinese, but I'll go for a Chinese meal, but it doesn't float my boat, if you know what I mean. So it does the incentive actually match everybody's expectations, and it's hard to get everybody on board with absolutely everything that you roll out. But as long as the majority is, then you should be fine from there. So let's look at another question then, Dave. I think this is more the funniest side of this. In your opinion, what's the worst incentive that you've seen, and then what impact did that have?
And again, it was another one of these where it was the flip side of the best incentive. So we had one where it was an end of year holiday, but you had to be 135% of target. About 20% into the sales year, there was a downturn. It was really difficult. And instead of either adjusting the target or just changing it completely, because actually we'd have been glad of 100% given the way the market had gone, the owners decided that they would just keep flogging this incentive. And even the very, very best people were struggling to get to 100, 110%. And yet there was this trip. And I think it was a trip to Scottsdale, Arizona. So it was not a cheap trip. It was a trip that involved golfing, it involved heat. Not everybody was into golfing, as you can imagine, but actually it turned out that the owners quite liked golfing and had always wanted to go to Scottsdale, Arizona. So this was the incentive. And I think, and this is me being a cynical team leader at the time, I think they were going to go whether or not the rest of the company made it. But it turned out to be a real disincentive because it was so far away, and every month it got further and further away. So it wasn't driving collegiate behavior. It wasn't even driving individual behavior. It was making people feel slightly annoyed. And it wasn't changed. Now, I wasn't experienced then, I was kind of new, but upon reflection, what I would have done is got the people together and said, we said we're going to do this. Well, actually, this is what's happened in the market. This is what's happened with our customer base. This is what's happening with our business because of that. We don't have the same amount of money coming in. So we're going to change the incentive. What do you think about this? Or what do you think about that? And have a conversation with the staff and then come up with something that would have been much more appropriate, because it's flogging a dead horse never works. This was definitely a bit of a dead horse, and it turned out not to be an incentive.
Interesting, isn't it, that we talk about certain things, and it's that that's an incentive that's been set that's almost unachievable due to outside influences and what have you. And I think some of the incentives that I've seen that I think haven't worked particularly well is when the incentive has been aimed to drive the business, but what they've done is actually stretch the target so far that it becomes that huge disincentive. And I don't think it's where you're going or what you're doing, it's that disincentive that's what's going on. And I think that's where people start to question that. It has to be achievable. It has to be people have to be able to see the potential that they can actually achieve that. Yeah. And I had a very similar story. It was I can't remember where we were going now. I think it was a quarterly incentive, and it was going. I think it was going to Portugal. I think. On a trip, but again, they set the incentive not around money performance, but they set it around KPIs. But set the KPIs so stringently hard that it just switched the salespeople off, and they just weren't bothered. And it actually created probably the poorest performance of the quarter of the quarter of that year, because they were really switched off, because it was all about the KPIs. And they did that, and then it was to vote for the back office who went, as the back office felt really disengaged from it, weren't part of it, and the front office felt absolutely appalled because they were trying to drive money by increasing the KPIs, and everyone saw through the incentive. Everyone saw through, yes, you're trying to hit KPIs because they drive more cash, but most of the cash that we're going to drive from this is going to come into the next quarter, and therefore what are you going to do next quarter? You're going to change that. But the incentive was just abominable from there. So if we start to think about things, and if we take cash out, and let's take travel out, because we know travel's a really good thing. Let's talk about things that we could implement that would be an incentive, but an incentive across all businesses, whether it be the sales unit, the finance unit, marketing unit, etc. What sort of incentives would you look to set, Dave?
Well, I think things that people have always liked, seem to like, extra days holiday. Or extra time out of the business. I know that costs the business money because you don't have people on the floor, but people like that. Little incentives that people like is leaving early. So one of the companies I work with, if they hit their targets, they get to leave at 3 o'clock on a Friday. Now you could look at that and go, but that's 2.5 hours out of sales time. 2.5 hours where we could be placing people and making money. But actually it does drive, for them, in their culture, it drives accelerated performance. People love the idea that if they do what they could do, that they get to leave early on a Friday. So those little things, lunch clubs I think are as important as ever. And I go back to your point about hybrid working. For many people, lunch is walking from their desk where they work to putting something on in the kitchen in their home. Maybe 3 days a week they're in the office, or 2 days a week, but the other side is that they're back at home again, and work becomes home and home becomes work. So the idea of having a nice meal in a restaurant with your colleagues becomes actually quite a nice incentive. So I think those sort of things matter. I think also, and this is not necessarily incentive, but it's an important aspect of culture, giving people time off to do non-recruitment type work. Maybe an extra day to spend with a charity of their choice. Something like that, from a cultural point of view, I think is a really good thing. Whether that will count as an incentive or not, I don't know. But, something that's different, something that's real, something that's meaningful, and something that doesn't feel as if it's too far away in today's environment where we're trying to work and mix the hybrid working. I think they are good things to do.
It's interesting, isn't it, that all those type of things. So I always think about sort of, I tell you what I used to do with my managers. I used to give my managers a certain budget every quarter, and say, I want you to come to me and say what you're setting your team to achieve. And it's an individual. So it wasn't a team when it was an individual to bring out something, but it had to be spread across their team. But that was for every single division. So whether it was the front, the back, office, etc., everyone had the same budget. And it was really interesting, the things that they sort of came up with. So people would come up with, I had one team come up and said, we want to buy a loadable credit card. So we can load the money on the credit card and give it to the person so they can just go spend it. And that was really interesting. We had one where we had one team, which was quite funny. I did roll this out across the business for a certain period of time because it was really funny, where they said the winner of it will take the money at lunchtime. They will go into the town, wherever they were, buy whatever the item was for the money that they had, and they had to come back. The team then had to vote whether the item or the money had been well spent on the item or not. And if it hadn't, they had to go back, get a refund, and go buy something different. And it was just really funny because you couldn't spend it on, you had to spend it on some things for yourself or something like that. But it was really funny what people came back with and stuff like that. And I think what we tried to do then is we tried to, certainly for the front office, we tried to put a gamification side into it. But then how do we roll that into the back office? So we looked at sort of gift vouchers, we looked at services, we looked at sort of love to shop, because love to shop gets round the commission, the tax side for certain things, especially if you're giving it as a reward. And so it was all about things that we could give, but the things that we found that did the most good was where everyone was involved and everyone felt that they had a chance of winning it. And you're right, days off, duvet days, etc. The other thing that we did was we asked for managers to vote across their business units on who they thought had been the most influential person in the business. And they would then come to me, and the 3 or 4 people that you had then in that group, we would then have a discussion about them, and the management would vote, and we would be then sending them away somewhere or doing something, but something was involved with their partners, etc., etc. So it was a really nice thing, and genuinely it was quite funny that, 9 times out of 10, it was someone from the back office that won those awards. And that wasn't by design, that was because that's what they felt. And it was interesting that how, that sort of drove people, where it was a reward or recognition of what people thought that you had given to the business. And I think that's the key thing about most incentives. It's the recognition of what you've done for the business and how it makes you feel. And that's what then drives people the following month or the following quarter, if they feel they've had that recognition.
I'll tell you a very quick, because of time, very quick funny story of the supermarket sweep. One of our offices in Chertsey did that, and we gave them money, or I didn't, but the manager did, and they had to go off and buy something. And they came back about 2 hours later with an office snake from the pet shop. And it was a giant snake that I thought it was really good. I think the snake survived about 3 hours before screaming people and a lot of other people thought, no, we can't have an office snake. And it went back to the pet shop, and then the pet shop wouldn't take it. And then it was absolute chaos. I think we lost half a day of proper sales time trying to resolve the issue of what we did with this Percy the snake.
Well, I can certainly say, Dave, I've not actually had a snake as an incentive, and I don't think I would.
I still don't know whether whoever did it, whether they did it as a joke or whether it was serious.
But I think what we're trying to say, though, about all the incentives that we do, they have to be achievable. From the outset, they have to be achievable, and we have to understand what motivates our people. And if we understand what motivates our people, then we can start to set the appropriate incentives that actually drive performance and drives behavior. And if we can drive performance and drive behavior, sometimes it's not about the money, sometimes it's the material things that help drive that and drive that performance. But the biggest thing, I think, from an incentive is it has to be the recognition. And that was interesting that all the stats pointed to that. The biggest driver was the recognition, either receiving an award, receiving a prize, irrespective of what the monetary value was, etc. It was receiving the recognition and receiving the prize. And it's how it's given is equally as important. So we need to start to think about that when we're sort of planning our incentives for the end of this year and next year, about what we can do to actually drive our business forward.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Dave, as always, thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated. Ladies and gents, again, thank you very much for your time. Next week, we start a whole new program. I'm just waiting for somebody to confirm a date for next week. So if they do confirm the date, then we've got an interesting guest coming on next week. If not, then we'll think of a topic that we want to cover with you guys, and that will come later. So we will have that out hopefully by the end of this week of what we're doing for next Wednesday. But thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you all next week.
Have a good afternoon, a good week. See you next week. Cheers, Dave. Bye-bye.
Cheers, Dave. Catch you later, mate.